Shabbat Shalom. My name is Kate. I have been coming to Beit Alef for, I guess, 14 or 15 years. The song that we sang tonight, Ma Tovu, I have to say is my favorite song in our entire songbook, because it was the song that was sung the night that I was received formally into the Jewish tribe after I had gone to the mikvah. How beautiful are your tents, O Jerusalem. And I could say also, Ma Tovu, how good it is to be here tonight after that 3-week break between services, which sadly occurs every time at this year, just when we tend to feel disconnected from the cultural mainstream and lonesome for each other's company. But we need not feel left out of the festivities, because you know what? We too have a nativity to celebrate. Less than a week after Christmas, we began reading the Torah portion called Shemot, which includes the birth of the greatest Jewish prophet who ever lived. Never again has there arisen in Israel such a prophet, we read just a few weeks ago at Simchat Torah. We Jews don't make a big deal about that prophet's birth, but I would like to honor it by telling the parallel stories of 2 of the most influential Jewish babies ever born, babies who grew up to become not only men of the year, but men of the millennia. Once upon a time, about 3,500 years ago, a Levite woman whose family had been living in Egypt for some generations gave birth to a child, wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a little waterproof basket to float upon the Nile River in the hope that he might escape the death that had been decreed for all newborn Hebrew boys. The backstory, as we know by heart, and as we read in this week's Parsha, is that there had arisen in Egypt a pharaoh who knew not the value of the Hebrew immigrants in his land and appreciated not the role that one of their own had played in rescuing Egypt from a terrible famine. Fearing that blue-blooded Egyptians were on the verge of losing their preeminence in the land because these immigrants kept multiplying, he declared a program to make Egypt great again. Pressing the Hebrews into unpaid labor, he persecuted them so severely that they wept and prayed for deliverance. But they didn't go away, and they didn't stop propagating. To curb their numbers, he declared that no male-gendered Hebrew baby should survive the day of his birth, even to serve as cannon fodder in the Egyptian army or as a construction worker on the royal pyramids. A tweet went out to the immigrant midwives, ordering them to snuff out the little boys' lives at the moment of birth. But the midwives united in passive resistance to abort this evil plan. We know the rest of the story. The child was rescued by Pharaoh's own daughter and grew up with the princelings of the royal household. Contrary to a common perception of Moses as a simple man, he was undoubtedly well educated in the wisdom and science of the day and fluent in at least 2 languages. This is the same man who begged off his divine mission with the excuse, "I have never been a man of words." It's also entirely possible, and this would help explain his spiritual evolution, that in the course of his studies, he learned about the religious revolution of Pharaoh Akhenaten, who had built a temple to a single creator of the universe. Long story short, Moses led a privileged upper-class life until the day he saw an Egyptian officer beating a Hebrew slave. At that moment, he stepped off the expected path of his life. In a fit of righteous rage, he struck the officer so hard that the man fell dead. Knowing that he was now in great political peril, Moses fled into the wilderness, and there, once again, he stepped off the path, this time to investigate a burning bush. The rest, as they say, is history. Our Jewish history, whether it's literally true or not. Fast forward about 1,500 years. In the little town of Bethlehem, A Hebrew woman gave birth to a son, wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger. The cattle were lowing, the donkey was braying, and 3 wise men came to visit with exotic gifts because a miraculous star was shining right over the place where the infant lay. The backstory here is that there had arisen in the land of Palestine a Roman tyrant who knew not the value of the indigenous people and appreciated not their customs and beliefs. Fearing that the people would rise up against him, he kept himself great by imposing ruinous taxes, conscripting the men for hard labor, and crucifying the opposition. Bad enough for this little boy to be born into such a world, but on top of that, the puppet king heard a rumor that a child had been born who would be his undoing. A tweet went out that all baby boys should be killed. This is starting to look like a pattern, and the infant barely escaped by being taken to Egypt for a few months until the king died. As a side note, isn't it interesting that we Jews keep going to Mitzrayim in times of famine or fear? But in this storyline, the child's family didn't fall into the psychological trap of staying too long in Egypt. Soon they returned to their hometown in Galilee, where the gospel says that the child, whom we now know as Jesus, advanced in age and wisdom. That would be Jewish wisdom, and probably plenty of it, for Galilee was a center of observant Jewish activism. He was steeped in the words of Moses and the other Jewish prophets, and at some point he was moved to follow in their footsteps. Stepping out of his workaday life, he began speaking out for the oppressed, comforting the afflicted, and afflicting the comfortable. Soon his followers began seeing him as a kind of savior or rescuer of his people, even as the long-awaited Messiah. At the very least, he was like a second Moses. Unlike Moses, though, Jesus didn't live to be 120, and he didn't liberate his people from the hated occupiers. Having spoken truth to Roman power a little too often, he was strung up on a cross like so many other resistors and died in his early 30s. Somehow, his body disappeared from its burial place overnight, and this gave rise to fantasies and hopes of a miraculous resurrection. Again, the rest is history. It's mostly a tragic history for the Jewish people, but that is not the fault of Jesus or his early followers. That can be laid at the feet of later generations of power-hungry church leaders, but that's another story for another time. So, where am I going with these parallel Jewish lives, which ended up diverging so dramatically? Here I have to interrupt myself and state that any political views I may present in the next few minutes are mine alone and in no way constitute an official Beit Alef opinion. Fast forward another 2,000 years. There has arisen in our land a populace that apparently knows not the deeds of Moses and appreciates not the teachings of Jesus. Immigrants are no longer welcome in our land of Goshen. Children's lives are threatened by the loss of health insurance. Farmers' and fishers' livelihoods are being destroyed by exploitation and degradation of the environment. And the working poor will soon be groaning under the burden of our new tax laws, just as the Hebrews were physically taxed to the breaking point under the Pharaoh's increasingly harsh demands. So it seems to me that nothing has changed but the day. Here we are, aching and longing for a savior, a Messiah, or even a principled politician to redeem our country from the Mitzrayim that it has become. Where is our Moshe? Where is Jesus in this land that professes to be a Christian country? But here's the thing. In the words of one of my favorite book titles, there is no Messiah, and you're it. Remember the childhood game of tag, where we would try to avoid being tagged so we wouldn't have to be it? Well, in this big old game of life, we have all been tagged. Each one of us is it. And what does that mean? In a powerful story from the Sufi tradition, a righteous man was distressed by the sight of a woman keening over her starving child and shooing flies off his dying eyes. "Oh Allah," the man cried, "you who are all-powerful, why don't you do something to help?" "I did do something," God replied. "I created you." Likewise, God created each one of us. Not that we have to rescue every orphan, take in every immigrant, or prevent every miscarriage of justice we see, but the Jewish way, the way taught by Moses and seconded by Jesus, is to do whatever we can to help heal our suffering world. We are not required to save the whole earth, the Talmud says. Moses didn't manage that, nor did Jesus, but neither are we allowed to sit on our hands and not do what we can. And when we do act to save a life, whether by political action or social outreach or random acts of kindness, the Talmud says it is as if we saved the world entire. I know I'm preaching to the choir here. Many of you are busy saving the world every day. I have not been so active myself since my idealistic youth. But in this new year, I want to be more conscious of the small things I can do to help heal the world. Rather than coasting through the last few years of my life, keeping my head down and wanting not to be inconvenienced by the needs all around me, I am resolved to step off the beaten path of my habitual haunts and patterns and pay more attention to the world outside my small existence. This doesn't mean I plan to be heroic or set the world on fire. I'm a quiet person with a quiet life, and I don't feel called to march in the streets or hound our leaders in Olympia. I greatly admire those who do, but for myself, I plead Moses' excuse that I am halting of speech and not skilled enough to lead the charge. Even so, I can do a small part by signing petitions and writing the occasional letter. I can work for racial justice by donating to organizations such as the Southern Poverty Law Center or the Equal Justice Initiative. And I can counter prejudice against the immigrant and the stranger by speaking up when I hear people making hateful and misinformed remarks. The opportunities for tikkun olam are endless, and I welcome any suggestions you may have about what a quiet person like me can do to help rescue the world in 2018. Maybe others also would welcome suggestions or would like to share their causes with the Beit Alef community. And one way that could happen would be to take more advantage of the Beit Alef listserv, the group email system. A few of you do use it now, off and on, and I, for one, would welcome more frequent posts about the causes that excite your passions and that I could support in a quiet way. I'd like to end with a little twist on a Christian saying, "What would Jesus do?" My resolution for this new year, as I said, is to pay closer attention to the needs around me. But that's just the first step. The second step is to ask, what would Moses do? Well, we know from this week's Parsha what he would do. First, he'd try to weasel out of doing anything at all, as I have often done. He'd say, who am I to get involved? He'd say, oh, I don't have the skills to deal with this. He'd say, by what authority am I speaking up? Or even, come on, I'm getting too old for this stuff. But then he would summon his courage, lean in, and do what needs to be done. The world needs that from us, and it is in each of us, it's in you, it's in me, to be able to do it.